Meurmishvili, the Cipher Brief's chief international correspondent, who has very close ties to Georgia, joining us now. Ia, welcome.
Thank you very much, Suzanne.
I really wanted to start off. It's nearly 2 weeks now that protesters have been in the streets of Georgia. How do you see this situation evolving?
That's a great question. Protesters have been out nonstop, day and out, for this past few days. Basically, starting from November 29th, a day after the Prime Minister announced that Georgia was halting its European aspirations for 4 years. The Prime Minister said that the government will not pursue any European integration measures until 2028. And that really caused the turmoil in the country. And mind you, just a month before that, Georgia had very contested parliamentary elections that have not been recognized by any of Georgia's Western partners, including the United States, the EU. OSCE has not published its report. So with this sort of background, election or contested election background, a month after that, Prime Minister basically comes out and says that Georgia is changing its foreign policy orientation. That generated a tremendous anger, especially in the young people. So they are the ones who are still out in the streets of Tbilisi, and some 43 other cities and villages in the country. So it's unprecedented for Georgia to have the entire country basically demonstrating. Now, how this can evolve and where this can go, that's nobody knows really. The government is pursuing this tactic to get the demonstrators tired, get them exhausted. It's cold in Georgia right now, so the government riot police is using water cannons, pepper spray, and in the cold weather, getting soaked by the water cannon is not a pleasant thing, I would imagine. So some of these tactics are probably meant to wear them down and get them tired, but the demonstrators don't seem to be affected by this. On the demonstrator side, they are demanding that unless the government calls for new elections to re-elect a different parliament, to have a government, and according to, this is maybe a bit too nuanced, but according to the Georgian constitution, after this parliamentary elections, Georgia was supposed to change into a Republican or the fully representative republic. So the parliament would elect the prime minister and parliament would elect the president. So that's why these elections were very important, and that's why the demonstrators are asking or demanding new elections. So if there is a new parliament in the country, not the one that's contested and disputed and dominated by the ruling Georgian party, but the coalition government, then Georgia still has a chance to continue its path to the EU.
Yeah, a critical time, obviously, in Georgia politically. What has the U.S. position been so far, and what do you think Georgians expect or would want to see from the United States?
The U.S. has been a strategic partner for Georgia, or U.S. Georgia have had strategic partnership since 2009, I believe. So for Georgia, that's been an independent country for 30 years. That's a very long strategic partnership with the United States. And this partnership just recently stopped. About a month ago, less than a month ago, U.S. announced that it's stopping strategic partnership with Georgia as a result of this policy review announcement that Secretary Blinken made sometimes this March of this year. So over time, the U.S. has been signaling the Georgian Dream government that we're not very happy the way our relationship and partnership is evolving. Maybe we should do something about it. And in response, the Georgian Dream government has been nothing but insulting and rejecting all these overtures from Washington. Georgian government has been very dismissive and very insulting towards U.S. ambassador to Georgia, both the previous ambassador and the current one as well. Um, and then the government and the parliament approved the so-called foreign agent law this spring in March of this year, which was a really big red flag for the U.S., not only just the U.S. government, but everybody in the West, the EU, the individual European countries. So that's when the U.S. government announced this policy review towards Georgia, and they've sanctioned 4 individual judges and people related to the justice system. They've also introduced travel restrictions or visa restrictions for some of the individuals who are involved in efforts to derail Georgian democracy. And now there's a big expectation from everybody in Georgia, both the government, I must say, and the opposition, that U.S. will announce personal financial sanctions against, in particular, the richest person in the country, Bidzina Ivanishvili, who made his billions in Russia in the 1990s. And he's basically the kingmaker in the country. He's appointing prime ministers. He rules the country from behind the curtains without having any public accountability. So U.S. has been involved, long story short, U.S. has been very closely involved, and still many people in Georgia are relying on United States coming out, potentially even maybe this week, and saying that the U.S. will financially sanction all involved in using force against the demonstrators and basically derailing Georgia's democracy.
And Georgia's president recently met with President-elect Trump when he was in Paris. What's the significance of that meeting, do you think?
I think it was very important. Georgian Dream, despite despite all these tensions and unprecedented, really, destruction of the relationship between the U.S. and Georgia, Georgian Dream government somehow still pushes this narrative that come January 20th, when Donald Trump become the U.S. president, Georgia-U.S. relationship will go back to normal, and it's going to be even better than before. Now, we don't know what they are basing this on, because there has not been any public record or on the Georgian Dream side or on the Trump transition team side that there was a phone conversation or some sort of meaningful contact between the government and Trump. So the fact that President Zurabishvili, who's the last directly elected president of Georgia, who has this tremendous legitimacy and support from, especially from the young people nowadays, she met with President Trump, and she announced that they had an in-depth conversation about stolen elections, which is also very significant. And to underline in the context of President Trump that elections were stolen, I think that was her big that was something that she chose, I'm sure, words very carefully, very meaningful comments to make after the meeting. So we should see. It seems like, I've seen the video, it seems like the President Trump was very involved and engaged. We don't know exactly what they talked about, but the fact that the opposition president that represents opposition to the ruling Georgian Dream Party met with President Trump first from Georgia, I think is very significant.
Yeah. Just to show how complicated the nature of this relationship is, Georgia's prime minister traveled not once, but twice to Tehran recently. Can you kind of explain how that might impact future relations between the U.S. and Georgia, and just kind of put it into place for us and provide some context around that?
Yeah, that's very, very interesting and important to talk about when we talk about U.S.-Georgia relations, and particularly after President Trump takes office. Georgian Dream keeps saying that, again, that somehow miraculously after January 20th, U.S.-Georgia will start this relationship from a clean page. U.S. is not going to remember any of the insults or attacks on U.S. representatives in Georgia, and all the accusations of U.S. trying to be involved. U.S. is trying to make a revolution in Georgia. That was one of the big narratives that the Georgian Dream was pushing out. So they are somehow trying to relate that only to the Biden administration and think that once Trump comes in, somehow the institutions and the organizational memory will forget everything else that Georgian Dream did. And what you mentioned about Iran is in that category. Exactly. So President Trump will have Iran as one of his main foreign policy challenges or issues that he will be paying attention to. Another thing is China, of course. And in the same context, earlier this year, Georgia signed a strategic partnership with China. And it happened it happened before United States stopped or suspended its strategic partnership with Georgia. So Georgia chose to be a strategic partner for both United States and China, which I don't think President Trump, at least from my understanding what his goal would be in foreign policy, would welcome that and would like that. Traveling to Iran was a very bad optics for the Georgian Dream. I don't know how they will recover from it as it comes to making overtures or to establishing good, healthy relations with the Trump administration. Georgian President Gobachidze was standing right next to the Hezbollah and Hamas leaders. Some of them, by the way, are no longer alive. And the first time he traveled to Tehran to be at the funeral of President Raisi, who, as you know, died in May in a helicopter crash. And subsequently, there was another trip after that, shortly after that. So, very interesting, very complex. Again, Georgia is thinking that we need to navigate this very complex region and play with all the players, including China, potentially Iran. Definitely not agitate Russia in all this. But how that's going to work out for Georgia, it's really unknown. And to navigate this, you really need the government that's experienced, understands all the complexities and nuance. And we see if this government even stays after these demonstrations. And if it does, then if he has the bandwidth to deal with all this.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Yeah, you know Georgia better than most people. As a final question, I just want to ask you, when we're thinking about Russian influence in Georgia and in the region, what do you think the opportunities will be with a new U.S. administration coming in to power in January? What do you think the opportunities will be to counter the Russian influence that is so pervasive in the entire region, not just Georgia?
I think this period presents a tremendous opportunity for anything democracy, Western values related against what Russia is trying to push out in the region. So in this past month, it's very also important for us and our viewers to remember what happened as it comes to Russia's influence in the region in this past month. Syria, as we saw, is Russia basically lost Syria, and together with Syria, potentially even Eastern Mediterranean. So we'll see how that goes, but Russia definitely has a weakened position in that region. We saw what happened in Moldova with all of its hybrid efforts that Russia used before or in the lead up to the Moldovan election. Even on the day of the election, pro-European forces won in Moldova. Moldova still has parliamentary elections coming up in April, so we'll see how that goes. But at least thus far, Russia was pushed back in Moldova. And we're seeing what's happening in Romania. Romania is also very important, given the fact that Russia and potentially China tried very hard to have this candidate emerge and be the lead and potentially be elected as the president of the country, who eventually did not make it. The Supreme Court basically said annulled the results of the first round in which the Russia-supported candidate was winning. So that's another loss for Russia. Now all eyes are on Georgia in this regard, to be honest, because everything is done by the Russian playbook in Georgia. The way the law enforcement is using force, the way they're against the demonstrators, the way they are arresting people, the methods they are using to frighten the youth, to control some of the elites of the country. Exactly the same way you would see it in Russia, and exactly the same way we saw it unfold in Belarus in 2020. In Belarus, the opposition had to flee, but in Georgia, opposition is not thinking about fleeing. So the opportunities that you ask about, I think, really are tremendous, as long as the West acts promptly and shows its support to the Georgian people who are in the streets, and the Georgian president who represents the Georgian people, who's basically the only legitimate institution in the country left today. So supporting Georgia, I think, would be democratic advancement of some sort in Georgia, and defeat of the Russian narratives and pro-Russian government in Georgia would be a very big step forward for the region, because I think many things depend on how Georgia goes. If Georgia falls, or if Russia dominates Georgia after this demonstrators, we don't know if it will have impact on Moldova's April elections. We don't know what impact it's going to have on some other Black Sea countries, be it Romania, Bulgaria, Armenia, Azerbaijan. So everything, I think, hinges on Georgia. And I'm not saying it because I'm of Georgian origin, but because it's a battleground. Georgia today is a battleground between Russia and the West. Russia is flipping governments, or is trying to flip governments in its immediate surrounding, especially as it wages this war in Ukraine. And Russia needs small victories. Georgia would be a very small victory for the West against Russia, but for Russia, Georgia will be a very big take in this fight against the West. And that's exactly how Russia is looking at this fight against the West.
Yeah. And yeah, it'll be really interesting to see who President-elect Trump chooses as his team of representatives on the ground, both in Georgia and throughout the region. Ian Meurmishvili, the Cipher Brief's chief international correspondent, we very much appreciate you putting so much incredible context around what's happening there. And I want to remind people one more time, you have an excellent piece that people can find at thecipherbrief.com that puts this into further context. Thank you so much. It's great to see you.
Thanks, Suzanne.